So hello, everybody. Welcome to the first meeting of riots here at Durham for the term. Can everyone hear me okay? Maybe let's just test. So Ben, do you want to just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So I appreciate everyone's patience here just as we got started. We just had a little bit of a tech issue with our owl who, in the words of our IT helper, has fallen off of his perch. So today we are really excited to have Ben Marwick with us. He's a professor of archaeology and director of the interdisciplinary minor in data science. And his empirical research tackles the integration of evolutionary models with archaeological evidence. And that's taken his research to some really exciting places around the world, including Asia and Australia. It's very focused on meta-scientific questions as well about reproducible research. And open science. And today he'll be speaking about his thoughts on layered reproducibility, which we're all really excited to hear about. So I'll let you take it away from there, Ben. Let's just make sure that you can share your screen.
Yes, here it comes.
Wonderful.
All right. Great, thanks so much. It's a real honor to be with you. I've been a long fan of the riots kind of clubs around the UK and often wished there was something nearby for me to join in. So it's a real pleasure and honor to kind of to be with you all. I don't know, I can't see anyone in there. I know there's
so I'm not sure we can hear you yet, Ben, although I do see that your screen's lighting up. So it's like, I think Zoom recognizes that you're giving audio and you're not muted or anything.
Oh, really? You can't hear me. Right. Let me.
He's not muted.
It's really quiet. I'm gonna take off my.
Oh, I think you.
Switching my sound to.
We can kind of hear you. You're just very quiet. Just see if whether I can also adjust anything on my end.
All right, switching the sound over from my AirPods to the computer.
I don't know why that would matter, but I made you the co-host just in case.
Select a speaker. There we go. Switch the speaker over. How about now? Can you hear me now at all?
Oh, actually, we're hearing from the audience that they can hear you. So I think it's actually just an audio output issue on our end. So yeah, please do continue, and my apologies for that as well.
All right, no problem. No, good for checking. I do admire all of your courage in organizing a hybrid event with in-person and video in the classroom. I know that's often risky and challenging, and I'm really impressed you guys are pulling it off. So I was just saying how honored I am to be involved in a riots event, having long been a fan of that community from afar, and wished there'd been something nearby for me. Okay, so like the title of what I want to talk about, like the layers of knowing and transparency and reproducibility for quantitative research. I'm hoping to speak at a level that's kind of relevant to people, to you, regardless really of what discipline you're in. I'm assuming it's not astronomy or oceanography, but something in the sort of social sciences that's sort of moderate sized data that you can probably fit in an email, and probably using something like R or Python. So let me get into it. Probably I'll tackle these three questions. What is reproducible research and why is it important? Probably we all have a fairly common notion of this, but I will just let you know what is my notion so that we can see that we have a common sort of approach to it or not. And then I will talk about these 5 layers of reproducibility in quantitative research, especially from the perspective of an R user. And I think, somewhat interchangeable for Python, but particularly referring to developments in the R sort of ecosystem that have been really exciting lately in the last couple of years for supporting reproducibility. And then finally, a few thoughts on what you as an individual can do and kind of things you can pursue at an institutional level. Just need to open the door slightly for my dog. Okay, what is it and why is it important? I mostly refer to this Turing Way kind of table, which I find really useful. You probably have seen because it's been quite widely circulated over the last few years. Putting reproducible research in this quadrant here, where the data set that someone else may be using, someone attempting to reproduce the research, is the same as the one that was used by the original researchers, and the kind of analysis that is done is also the same. So using, let's say, the same R script with the same data files, And it's kind of mechanical, running of the script of the same data set to get basically the same results. And in simple cases, obviously that's very trivial, but in realistic cases, typical published paper, this is not trivial, especially with respect to dependencies, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. To further kind of subdivide reproducibility, I quite like the approach that this is Victoria Stodden here, is a great authority on the topic internationally. And she's kind of subdivided into these three dimensions: computational, empirical, and statistical. I think these are quite useful because sometimes when maybe we think about reproducible research, or we think as an R user, for example, other people have quite a different approach. And they may be talking, for example, so the approach that I'm mostly interested in is this computational element, where it's like stuff that all the things that happen on the computer pretty much. But then there are other things that perhaps other people are thinking about when we talk about reproducibility. Empirical reproducibility, as an archaeologist, this is like, can we dig up the same archaeological site and find basically the same kind of patterns of human behavior in another, if we dig a hole next to the previous hole, or in a wet lab, like, can we do the procedure on the bench procedure, get the same result using similar reagents and similar environmental conditions and so on. And finally, statistical reproducibility. And I think, this is the one that most people who are not sort of steeped in the literature on reproducible research and open science, that's probably what is in their mind mostly. And finally, statistical reproducibility is about sort of very complicated statistical analyses where there's a lot of scope, for example, for p-value hacking and other kinds of manipulation. So a lot of I highly recommend her writing on this topic, because I find it very useful for realizing what exactly is it that I'm very obsessed about in terms of reproducibility, and what parts of the topic am I perhaps ignoring, or is in other people's minds when we talk about promoting reproducible research and so on. So this is just kind of narrowing the scope of where I'm coming from. So I'm very interested in the journal article. Traditionally, this is our way of communicating. Here's a picture of a 17th century journal article, one of the first ones ever published. And this is, this sort of stock in trade of our way of communicating our results with each other. And I often ask myself, and like many other people who are interested in this topic, like, is the journal article sufficient? I usually come to the conclusion that no, it's not. Here's the journal article at the top here that is sort of covering or representing this sort of huge set of other things that we usually want to know about a study to just make sense of it, to be able to make a credible assessment of its reliability, or to use it in some practical way to to apply a new method to our own data, or to sort of understand how well the result of that study applied to the result of our study, and so on. All these other things, typically, increasingly sort of nowadays, as things are very computationally intensive, these kind of things are often not specified very well, or in enough detail in the paper for us to get satisfaction about how confident we can be in the work, or how effectively we can sort of transport the approach into our own study. So that's why me and not entirely original observation, the journal article is not really sufficient anymore, really, for providing satisfaction on understanding and reusing a study. So I've become interested in, like, how can I personally surface more of these things about my own work so that other people can use it? And how can I kind of delicately request them from other people, or provide sort of gentle on-ramps for other scholars, my peers, and so on, to share these things in ways that don't seem too intrusive, like, give me your code. People often still feel very much that that's a private thing that they shouldn't be expected to ask. And if you do ask, you're kind of annoying. So these are some of the challenges around this kind of current conventions. Okay, a couple of motivations. Why do I feel this is important? Like, why do I spend a lot of time sort of looking into our ecosystem and fiddling with code to a point where I feel other people can see and make use of it? And first one is, I think I have 3 or 4 points here: to accumulate reliable claims about the world. And you may recognize this is Robert Boyle and his vacuum pump over here. And he was so concerned that other people would get a correct kind of understanding of the properties of vacuums and so on, that he produced these incredible illustrations of his apparatus so that other people could recreate the exact apparatus. And then his narrative descriptions of it were also exquisitely detailed, even to like the point where he would make his pump and then he would describe the tiny little dents that were on it, and just in case they were relevant for other people who might make a pump and then observe something slightly different, they might say, oh, it's because of the dents and so on. So he was very interested in accumulating reliable information about the properties of vacuums, and we should be about our research as well. And a classic example that you may already know of from a few years ago, these economists, Reinhardt and Rogoff, who who work on GDP ratios of debt to GDP, and they talked about how their discovery was that if you have a high debt to GDP ratio, a certain country, then they will have a lower level of growth, and this is their kind of their controversial result right here. High level of debt to GDP ratio, low level of growth, and this became very influential, and many kind of like national economies sort of adopted this result. Okay, we need to like squash that debt to GDP ratio down, otherwise we're going to have an episode of really low growth. And they were quite, they sort of had a book, and Greece in particular was very keen on this policy at a national level. And then, as often the case in economics, it's typical to have like a replication seminar for graduate students as part of their training. And some of them, a bunch of graduate students acquired the spreadsheet that Reinhard Rogoff used. They didn't present it openly with their publication, and found this exact thing here. And this is such a nice study for two reasons: partly because the result is so consequential. Like for most archaeological findings are not going to have an impact on a national economy, but Ivy League economists quite likely will. And secondly, because the error is so glaring. So you can see this is the selection of Excel sheets that was used to calculate this notable result. And these graduate students, they didn't do really any highly fancy statistical analyses and so on. They just realized that, they just needed to like drag that selection down all the way. And as you can see, it would flip the sign of the result and be, the Reinhard Rogoff was here, and then the graduate students up here, and flip the kind of the consequence. So it had sort of quite serious implication of not quite getting the selection, the full set there. So this is a nice example of like, okay, so they produced an unreliable claim, and perhaps if they had presented their data at an earlier point, before they published their blockbuster books, that could have been avoided, and a more reliable claim about the ratio of debt to GDP could have been, and growth could have been proposed instead. A second point for me, especially, that to avoid duplication of effort and wasted resources, sometimes feels like, read a paper, see something really cool, a method, for example, and apply it on my own stuff, and then you have to sort of reinvent the wheel if the author hasn't shared any code, for example. And so that to me feels like a waste of resources that is unnecessary, when there's often no reason why that code can't be shared, and then I can use it more seamlessly and don't have to waste so much time sort of reinventing the wheel that someone else has done. Identifying new areas of research, and this, I think, some disciplines are already quite ahead of this detail, but I think many social sciences are not really, where a large-scale synthesis of data can be produced by sharing, and then questions that so far have only been answered in a fairly unsatisfying way on smaller data sets can be answered in a much more compelling way on a bigger one. And maybe part of the challenge here is that in many social sciences, especially, the collection of data is quite unsystematic, and we often don't use the same sort of variable names or measure them in quite the same way, and that makes it difficult to combine. So perhaps sharing, being more open, would sort of lead to some consensus on some variables that currently we're kind of all over the place with. And finally, to make research accessible and inclusive, I think this is an underappreciated point, I think, especially because in a time where we're increasingly aware of who are those people who have been historically excluded from our disciplines, and asking the question of how can we increase their inclusion and make at least the demographic and socioeconomic diversity of our discipline resemble the communities in which we live and work. And I think, working in, for example, programming languages that typically facilitate reproducibility, they're often open source ones, which are free to get, no licenses required. And then sharing those code and data can openly on a repository, for example. People at, for example, smaller research institutions, not highly well-funded universities, and then freely access all that material. And so they have much more potential to participate in sort of high-level exciting research than if we all are working in proprietary research, proprietary software, not sharing our data. And not only like within our own kind of countries, can we sort of, I think, broaden the accessibility of research by using free and open source tooling, and then having a culture of sharing. But there's this sort of sense of like global north and global south, and countries of the global south, typically low or middle income countries, are sort of excluded in a similar way. Like their universities often don't have funding for software licenses, and they maybe lack the the participation in sort of rich networks of elite scholars to get access to databases and projects where they can work on data that's exciting and allows them to participate in the international sort of stage of their discipline. So if we are using free and open source tools, and if we have a culture of sharing, institutions in low and middle income countries have a much better chance to participate and sort of teach their students in ways that are currently very difficult because they maybe depend on software licenses and data that's hard to find. So I feel this is a kind of very noble motivation for reproducible research, not just about the sort of some selfish and sort of communitarian goals for our own research communities, but to address some of these issues that have become quite prominent and urgent recently, as around decolonizing research activities and so on. In archaeology and anthropology, this is a concern that we have because we're often we're very extractive. We go to typically low middle income countries and we dig stuff up and then we bring them back to our museums, and nearly everyone who's involved is from the rich Western country. And so I think about this a lot, and I think that this is one way in which we can kind of undo some of those harmful legacies. Okay, so now I've kind of hopefully demonstrated a similar approach that we might all have to thinking about what counts as reproducible research and what are some of the motivations for it. I will now go on to my substantive section, which are these 5 layers of reproducibility and quantitative research that really is based on my own practice, but highly influenced by Noam Ross and Carl Bödiger, whom you may have heard of. They're often quite active on Twitter, and they're a big part of the R community, especially in kind of ecology and biology in the United States. And they're involved in an organization called R Open Sci, which is kind of a nonprofit community organization around promoting the use of R in academic research, industrial science. And so they're sort of smart people on the topic of reproducibility as well. So, and I think many of their practices, they're quite sort of, they're very cutting edge. And I will often watch to see, what are Noam and Carl doing? And I will do that in a couple of years when it's a bit easier and documented. So let's get into these layers then. Okay, so I will exploit the kind of, the onion as a kind of metaphor for this concept of layers. In terms of like, the outer layers are like the simplest and easiest ones. And these are things that I will confidently teach in an undergraduate class. I feel like most undergraduate students can manage this kind of thing. And by the time we get to the middle of the onion, these are really the very painful, difficult things that our eyes are now streaming with tears as we're getting through the layers of the onion, and very unpleasant. And we might question whether or not it's worth it, as I do. So firstly, R script, and you may know Quarto. It's the new generation of R Markdown, which is, I will show you in a second. But this is, I feel, the most basic way which we can sort of enter the sort of process of making our research reproducible, is simply use these things rather than using point and click kind of software such as Excel or other common software packages in our discipline. So simply using a scripting language, and of course it doesn't have to be R, but any other kind of open source language would satisfy this one. Or Quarto, which is a literate programming approach. I think it's a great first step, and you can say to yourself, yes, I'm making a commitment to reproducible research at the first layer, and put that into grant applications and job ads and fellowship applications and so on. Here's an example of Quarto, in case you haven't seen it. Very similar to R Markdown in that you can have bits of sections of plain narrative text, the paragraphs that you write in your paper, and then you can also have chunks or blocks of code in between the paragraphs of text, and you type this kind of source document like this. You just sort of plainly type these things on your keyboard, and then you have a button or run a line of code to render that source into some output. Then you get this beautifully formatted document. In this case, the output is set as HTML, but you can output to a Word document for submitting to journals, typically what I do, or PDF for other cases. And then you have the usual sort of text decorations. And look how elegantly this kind of cross-reference has been transformed into a kind of human readable one with an automatically numbering, and there's a caption to the figure, and a beautiful figure using the ggplot2 package you can see later over here. So this kind of literate programming approach, where you can have regular paragraphs of text, introduction, methods, conclusion of your paper, and then throughout blocks or chunks of code that do the work, and then you can share this document, this source document, Quarto document, as, for example, supplementary material, supplementary information for a paper or put in a repository and so on. Very low barrier to entry, I feel. And anyone who basically uses R or Python, or I think Corto can manage maybe 20 or 30 languages, can I think pick up writing in Corto in just a couple of minutes. So I think this is quite a fine point to suggest as like the first layer that anyone can get involved in. Writing code rather than point and click. That's really the critical sort of step here. Write nice code with comments. And this is a package called here for avoiding absolute paths. So absolute paths are like a discrete path to a location on my computer somewhere, which doesn't exist on anyone else's computer. And that can really be a nuisance for trying to run someone else's code. Someone else's code you surely have encountered if you've probably run any code at all. And then, as I say, like if you write a simple R script or a Corto document, you can put this in the supplementary information of a journal article, or put it in a repository with a DOI, and then link the DOI, mention the DOI in the text of your paper, and then you're done. You can feel a sense of satisfaction that you've made a commitment to reproducibility, and you've achieved it, and you're sort of probably doing more than a large percentage of people in your discipline. So it's the first level, and I think accessible to undergraduates as well. I'm teaching a class right now where the students are writing weekly lab reports in Corto, and they're just basically going fine. And these are people who are, archaeology students who have never done any kind of coding or have a fear of computational work. So here's how I'm going to sort of measure these layers of reproducibility on the pain scale. Over here, I will say using R script or Corto, low on the pain scale. Pretty straightforward. Kind of complexity, relatively low complexity, relatively low effort. So I'll put it down here. Everyone is still smiling. Undergraduate students happy and excited to be learning this stuff. But the benefits, sort of correspondingly, are just a little bit better than just having published your article alone without any additional material. We'll say benefits the researcher who might want to come back and reuse their stuff and know they can find it because it's on a repository rather than having to fish through their hard drive. And then I'd say they're doppelgangers. So other people who are kind of like that researcher, look like the researcher, have the same background, the same level of training with code and data and so on, doesn't really, and maybe can sort of read their mind about like what packages do you load, what versions of the packages, and how to can read in between the lines very effectively. So there's some benefit, but it's kind of to a limited audience. Okay. Why would we have any other layers? Because simply using code, any other layers of reproducibility is not enough. This is quite a fascinating study, not in the social sciences, but computer science. And they took 601 studies, like papers, where code was available on like GitHub repository or something like this, web applications or sort of computer science things. I don't know exactly what. And the main point was 600 things where the code is available. So someone did share all their scripts and so on, but only some tiny fraction of that, just over what looks like 200, a third, could be actually reproduced in any way. And then for a whole bunch of reasons, many of them, they couldn't get things to work. So it's not really enough just to share the code if you want to have high confidence that someone else can make your stuff work and having hope at the reproducibility that maybe you're aiming for. So second layer of the onion. So we've got here with our script and Corto, and now we're diving down a bit further here. Now, we're sort of, it's a frenzy in the kitchen and we're cutting things up and maybe our eyes are starting to water a little bit. I will suggest that the R package structure or this package itself for managing dependencies are a good next step if you are feeling adventurous. So this is a fairly new package of the last couple of years. You may know PackRat, which is a kind of ancestor to this one. This is far easier to use. What does it do? It can give you great isolation for your work so that you can have a project on your computer and install packages specifically for that project. And when you install packages in your regular sort of desktop environment, it won't touch that project's packages. So you can be very bold and experimental and download the latest versions of packages just to explore on your computer. And then when you open a certain project, it will use an earlier version of that package, which is very stable and reliable. So this enables you to send projects to other people, or if you're collaborating, you can collaborate on projects across different computational environments, knowing that you'll have the exact same package version. So it's kind of tackling part of the dependencies that exist within R at least, and that's really super. And if you have done some collaboration with other people using R over projects that span several years, where there are likely to be updates in packages that you're using, you likely have encountered this problem where someone is using an old version of the package and something doesn't work, or it works slightly differently, and it's quite frustrating sometimes to troubleshoot. And sometimes people aren't very willing to update their packages because, like, oh, this version has served me well for many years. I don't care about the latest fancy version. So this RN package can help to manage that. Exact package versions, and that's good for reproducibility, because often behaviors of packages can change, especially big packages that exist for a long time can have breaking changes kind of every couple of years. So this is a package I really enjoyed using. Take a lot of headache out of this problem here. The second approach to embracing this second layer of the onion is to use the R package structure. And here's a figure from a paper that Carl Burke and I and another author wrote to sort of argue the case that this was a viable thing to do. You may think of the R package as like, it's very arcane for methods, communications, very specialized, not relevant to me as a scholar who writes manuscripts and so on. But our point was, in fact, that our package structure is quite practical for organizing materials in a research project, because it has this very standard, conventional, well-understood way of communicating things, like communicating metadata about the project, metadata, sort of names and ORCID IDs and email addresses, basically. But also package dependencies can be named in there, and the exact version numbers in there as well. There's a very standard way of expressing the licensing terms of your materials, and you may use like MIT license for code and CC BY for your text and so on. You can communicate that to other people in a very formal way that other people will quickly understand. And then you can have like the sort of meat of the compendium down here. Nowadays this would be the quarto document and then the data file there, for example. So package structure, another approach. If RN doesn't quite sound right to you, you may consider using a package structure. Lots of great tooling in R, the dev tools package, and use this package. And now we have this RR tools package inspired by dev tools. So dev tools is for people who develop packages. RR tools is kind of the same thing, but for developing a research compendium, really, which is a package that is used to hold, a sort of small to medium-sized piece of research that's sort of centered around a Markdown document. So here's the paper that figure came from before. And this package here kind of is a templating package that will set you up with a set of folders and Markdown documents, README and so on, with licenses suggested. So you can just get started writing your document, and it guides you on where to put the data so that other people can find it and so on, or if you can share it or not. And then taking such an approach will allow you to put something like this into your manuscript or your reports and publications. Is something I try to put in all of my publications. An entire section, usually at the end of the methods, and about reproducible open source materials. The entire R code is contained in the supplementary materials, and you may recognize this is deposited in particular on the OSF, Open Science. Is it Framework Foundation? I can never remember exactly what is going with that F, but a good place for collaborating and sharing materials and archiving them there as well. Version control, we're using Git and GitHub. I won't mention that anymore here, but just so you know, it can be meant. I think it's fine to mention there. And we mentioned the licenses that we attach on in the sort of spirit of the R package as well. So I think it's quite a nice way to communicate the fact that all these materials are available to the reader, who may be highly educated by lots of new ideas in a paragraph such as this. And I have seen, in fact, a few people put very similar paragraphs into their papers, which is heartwarming, of course. Okay, so level 2, we're creeping up the pain scale. You can see this, the mouth is flat here. It's a bit like, okay, I'm doing this, but it is a bit of overhead and a bit of extra work, low to middle in the pain scale, moderate effort and complexity. Managing package dependencies can be kind of a nightmare on complicated packages, and packages that have dependencies that go beyond R as well. But then the benefits, I believe, are sort of correspondingly higher. So, there's a greater chance that people who are not exactly like you can reuse the materials, because they don't have to sort of fish around and work out exactly which version of the package did you use and so on. There's a bit more context and documentation available. So, and there's a good chance that your stuff will remain reproducible longer into the future than if you just have a plain R script. Okay, so we've done this layer here, plain R script. This layer here is some way of managing the dependencies within R. And now we have getting into the third layer, really getting to the core of the onion now. We're probably tears streaming down our eyes. And my third point is my third layer, using target or make for workflow documentation. So you may know make from the world of Linux as a sort of package compiling or software. It's not part of R, but targets is an R package that kind of takes that same spirit of like automating a workflow and makes it in the R idiom kind of more natural and intuitive. I did once try to, people get very excited about make, and I tried a little bit, it's a whole nother language, and I don't really, my brain is not big enough to manage really more than one. So it's R for me all the way pretty much. And once targets came out, I was like, okay, this seems like worth getting to know because it provides that advantage of what make does, but I don't have to learn the language. So pipelines and workflows, especially when you have, these are ways to communicate these, especially when some elements of that take a really long time to run. Some computations take hours or days. You don't want to run them every time you have to like produce the output. You want to be able to skip some of those, especially those parts that haven't changed. And you want maybe your users to be able to do that as well if you can provide them with the sort of pre-processed part of the workflow. Perhaps they don't have access to the same computation resources. You can say, okay, here's the thing that took 100 hours. You can either do that yourself, or you can just take this bit from us, and then you can explore some of the outputs where it's sort of more convenient and maybe more interesting to explore. So targets package, make like pipeline toolkit is kind of what it is here. So you kind of set up these instructions without repeating yourself, without rerunning things that take a long time, costly runtime, and it will only rerun things that have been changed since the last time it was run. So it runs only necessary computation. So it can be very time-saving for somewhat complex projects that just have little bits in them, maybe not little, but sections of them that take a long time to run. And so this has been quite actively developed over the last few years. It supports all kinds of things that are typical to computationally intensive work, cluster and cloud computing and so on. And so how does it look? We may do something like this, numbered imperative scripts where there's like script 1 and script 2, and I will surely do this, normally now, and as part of getting to just layer 1 reproducibility and leave it at that, especially when working with students for whom targets is a layer of complexity I don't want to impose on them. But if this is a way that you're working and maybe you're at the limits of your satisfaction with this, you might consider using targets, which will divide, which will instead take an approach where everything in these steps is some kind of function. So maybe these first 2 steps here could be represented by this single function prepare recipe, and it does a bunch of things. And then instead of a script, all of this code in that script should be represented as a function, and then you can organize the functions into this kind of set here. Prepare recipe function here we can see is represented in this step of the targets workflow down there, and then the input is indicated as well. So it's a little more explicit, I guess, and detailed in the order of events and what is happening and what are the inputs and outputs there as well. So I've only used this a couple of times so far, just on projects that have a lengthy computation in the middle of it, which I don't do I'm happy to do once, and then I want to sort of spend a lot of time iterating over the downstream elements of it. And I found it quite useful, and it works well with Quarto also. So this is another kind of step into another sort of level of complexity, another layer. And by now we're getting to the point where you really have to have a high level of commitment to exploring kind of technologies to support reproducibility. Can be, it's a new thing, relatively new. The documentation is quite good, and the package also is very responsive and helpful. So that takes some of the pain out of it. But definitely, learning a new thing can be a challenge, and it's just a whole sort of another way of thinking that's quite different from running analyses typically. So we have to be completely transparent, honest. It's a little can have elements of not fun about it. So middle high on the pain scale. You do need a high tolerance for functional programming, since everything has to be a function in the targets world, and that's fine. Most people who enjoy using R are quite comfortable with that because it's a pretty fundamental concept to R anyway. This notion of everything being a function. But actually you can use R quite well, be quite effective without embracing that element of it really. And it benefits computation intensive users who are familiar with this concept of workflow and appreciate being able to skip time consuming parts that maybe they don't even have access to the infrastructure to run on. And they will appreciate the ordering and the explicitness of how the analysis is documented in this very sort of computer style way. And I think it will allow the reproducibility of the analysis to live longer as well, have a longer lifespan. Maybe targets will be great for a couple of years, and then the developer will become, old and die, and then either someone else will take over, or a whole other package will take over that maybe uses a different platform. But it's likely the case that the workflow that you document in targets could be easily translated into whatever the next generation is, and maintain its reproducibility into the future. Okay, by now we're in this kind of layer here, I think. Really, people, just for people who really like onions or really like reproducibility. So at the fourth layer, I will talk about, I mentioned the Docker file, right? So now, by now, we're sort of all been within the R environment. All this stuff here is like within, that you never leave our studio, say, working on this. Targets is really an R package, and it's all about workflow, and then REnv is about managing R package dependencies. But what happens when we step outside of R and we have packages that require packages that are not R packages? And so typical ones that often are complex, anything to do with kind of Bayesian analysis, like JAGs and so on, that they're required dependencies that are system level that you install on your computer that are not part of R, and things that are to do with like geographic information systems, sort of spatial analysis, like GDAL, and I can't remember some of the others, but you often have to install something else on your computer for those packages to work first. So Docker is an approach, a technology that helps to manage system level dependencies that our packages often depend on. And you may be familiar with it a little bit. You surely have heard of the concept of a virtual machine, where you can install a computer inside your computer. So for example, I'm running a OS X Apple computer, and if I want to run a Windows computer, I can install a virtual machine on my Apple laptop, and I can run Windows within it. So it's like computers within computers, sort of Russian doll of computers like this. And Docker gives a similar kind of approach, but you can see the stack of things, of sort of software, is shorter. So it's a more efficient way to virtualize or run other operating systems on your computer or any other computer. So instead of having this huge chunk of stuff here, or it starts at hypervisor to guest OS, I guess it's this sort of layer here, we can skip some of those things and just have this Docker engine and binaries, libraries, and then the apps running there. So it's a more efficient way to kind of give high level of computational isolation and portability, where we can take the tiny computer that runs on my computer as a Docker container and put it on yours, or scale it up hugely into a cluster, and so on. And so the metaphor is kind of this shipping container, where shipping container is very standardized size and shape and can fit on any kind of ship, really. And so a Docker container is the same thing, very standardized, that can run on almost any kind of modern computer. And in sort of the manifest for the Docker image, we have this Docker file that says, okay, these are the things that you ought to install, the various libraries and other dependencies, that can include LaTeX and Pandoc for producing documentation. We have an explicit kind of recipe for generating the container, which then can run identically regardless of the hardware that it's on. That's the kind of advantage here. So then we can be very precise about all the dependencies outside of the R environment as well. Those things that maybe we use for Bayesian analyses or GIS analyses can be specified in much the same way we would specify with the REnv package or with an R package description. Now we can do it for the whole kind of computational environment, or most of it at least. So now, as you probably can guess, these are ordered, each of these in terms of their level on this pain scale. And by now we're getting right to the top. And once again, like writing Docker files and turning them on and off and so on is another language again, separate from R, and takes some getting familiar with to make it work. And that can be frustrating. I certainly have experienced a lot of frustration exploring it. High complexity for most researchers. These are really like software engineering kind of tasks, and if you don't really identify as a software engineer or feel that's part of your job, you will just feel like this is ridiculous and there's no point for me to do this. This should be someone else's job. And in some cases, it could be if your institution is well resourced and you have software engineer staff you can draw on, they can help with this, I'm sure. But it can feel like this is beyond the pale of a typical researcher's requirements. But the upshot is maximum portability and encapsulation of the research compendium, not just our code and some of our packages, but really the whole computational environment, or a large part of it, that a researcher used. And then you're sort of achieving now this long-term reproducible research, where you can be fairly confident that as long as something like Docker is around, all the rest will follow. All the other things is just going to work. So there's still obviously a time limit and a point of vulnerability if Docker should disappear or be replaced. But everything is kind of encapsulated in there in that Docker container. And so it's definitely been the case that I've worked on long-term projects that have spanned several years and different computers that I've been using personally. And things don't run anymore from one computer to another, and I will run things in a Docker container and enjoy the satisfaction of it working, because it's all of the details of control that I am not even hardly aware of various other package dependencies on the computer outside of R. So it's definitely been a lifesaver a couple of times for me. not something I don't work in Docker all the time. Carl Bodecker, whom I mentioned a couple of times, he's very serious about Docker, and his whole computer is set to Docker containers. His email is a Docker container, and then he switches over to R and Docker container. It's all he's very committed to this way of working. For me, I'm kind of somewhat less. Okay, and by now we get to the very, I don't know, what do you call this part of the onion, the very center of it. And by now you've been highly exposed to all of the uncomfortable vapors that come out of the onion, and your eyes are really streaming and watering, and you just wish you could cook and eat, and starving for the delicious meal that all this is going to make. And my fifth layer of reproducibility is this technology called Binder, where you can serve a runtime environment to another person through the browser. So this is quite fun and neat. What makes it a sort of worthy of being in this kind of most challenging point is that it's basically like doing all of these other things, but on someone else's computer that you can't really see, or it's quite, you're sort of working almost, sort of feels like working blind, trying to make it work. So I'll show you kind of what I mean by this. So Binder, you may know, it's been around for a few years, cloud service where you can share reproducible interactive components. So in fact, I will show you in a second, you can present RStudio in the browser to anybody who has a web browsing connection. And in that RStudio instance or session, the files and code that you want them to see will be presented, and they just have to, if they're basically familiar with R and RStudio, they can execute your code in the browser, no download required. All the dependencies are there in the browser. They can, run your code and modify it. And they can't save it in the browser there, but they can explore modifications and, test assumptions that you might have had about your data that they feel are not correct. So you might have an R Markdown file or Quarto file on a GitHub repository. This is a very typical example, one that I use a lot. And then you have a link to Binder on the GitHub repository. Someone clicks on that and they will see RStudio and can run that code immediately anywhere on the internet. So this is a package here that kind of helps to equip your project with a Binder service. This is by Karthik Ram, who's another prominent member of the rOpenSci organization like GNOME and Carl. And this package he has called, the package name is not clear, Hole Punch, here it is here, will help to equip you with this Binder service. And here's a recent example of mine that I'm particularly happy with, a paper this is in eScience, and it's a big sort of consortium authorship, the ArchaeoGlobe project. And then we had a sort of short essay in The Conversation, you may know, is a place where academics go to share the plain English versions of their papers in 1,000 words or less. And part of the goal here was like make it possible for anyone to see everything that we did in this project as clearly as possible, and invite sort of stimulate reuse and so on of the data. So we have together with some other sort of members of the core authorship team, we have a GitHub repository, and then you can see down here the Binder button, this blue one. And when you click on the Binder button, you begin this process here that I've captured in this GIF, where RStudio is starting. You can just make out here, this is a browser tab here. This is supplementary information, not the entire manuscript here, but you can see blocks of code here and blocks of text in between in a typical literate programming environment. This in fact is R Markdown. This is pre Quarto, but Quarto is what I am writing now. And you can see some code has been run in the console down here, and then some output has been generated right there in the plots panel. So this is really nice. I think this is a really nice way to really put reproducibly in other people's, in other people's faces, like make it clear to them that you want them to have a look, and you're making it as easy as possible for them to. So here it is restarting the GIF, starting up the server, preparing the environment and so on. Makes it as easy as possible. No need to download or unzip or install anything. It's all just right there. And of course, there are some limitations on your side as the person whipping this thing up. It can be quite difficult. Can be some challenges with some exotic packages making them work, because you're not making them work on your computer. You're making them work on this cloud thing where you can't maybe look at things and inspect things in quite the same way that you're used to. Sort of command line terminal work to diagnose some of these things. Most of the time, they just work. And then there's some limitation on the user side. Obviously, you can't put very large data sets in here, and you can't put very long running ones. So the Binder service has some limitations, 1 hour or something. They had some problems early on with people running Bitcoin mining on these, and needed to impose some limitations so that it was, being used for the intended purpose. But this is really nice. And I try to do this on all of my papers that are, that don't have high long run times or long big data sets, because it's just a nice way to, it's like a, sort of museum display almost of the research, like where someone can come and take a close look around and maybe even reach in and touch a few of the artifacts and kind of handle the things that to give them a more intimate, visceral experience of the research, and obviously allow them to reproduce it in a very direct way. There are equivalent, similar things to Binder that allow you to like embed a compute capsule that looks exactly like this in the middle of like a journal article or the HTML page of a journal article. So you may have heard of Code Ocean, which is they're a commercial service that deal with publishers, and they provide this kind of service to publishers. So you may publish an article. I think Cambridge University Press journals have this technology, and so you can publish your article, and in the middle of the HTML page, you can have exactly like this. You can have RStudio just sitting there waiting for people to start click on things and run code and explore the analysis directly. Okay, so finally with Binder, we're finally kind of maxed out on the pain scale. And it's painful because it's kind of like doing things in the dark, like setting it up on Binder. Most of the time it's straightforward. When it doesn't work, you kind of have to reach into someone else's computer where you can't really see very well on the cloud computing, and I find that sometimes a little tricky. But I think highly accessible and transparent. So kind of equivalent to using Docker as well, because Binder runs on a Docker container. So you do need, at some point, a Docker file needs to be generated. Usually that can be automatically generated, for example, by the hole punch package. But sometimes you may need to kind of reach in by hand and edit that Docker file to just get things exactly right. So all of the pain and discomfort that with using Docker is involved here as well. But the upshot is highly accessible. So any person anywhere in the world with an internet connection can have a chance to run your code. They don't need to download and install packages and so on. And so as long as the internet exists, really, I think you've got a good chance of your material being reproducible. So I feel very optimistic about this, and I feel it's generally worth it. It's easier for me to say because I've had a few years to kind of overcome the kind of trade-off of the pain and the returns. But I think it's quite nice to have be able to present reproducible research in such an accessible way. It's so easy to see what people can do there, rather than that paragraph in the paper that says DOI etc. code there. And sometimes that's a bit. There's a bit of friction there because navigating through the repository is, for people who've never been to a repository, they may struggle to find what they want. But with Binder, it just pops up on the screen and it's all there, and they don't have to like unzip or do anything. Okay, so there's my 5 layers. Now I will switch over to some sort of practical sort of suggestions that I'd like to pass on that sort of relate to perhaps most of these 5 layers, and generally approaching reproducible research. Perhaps you're sort of straddling some of the layers. How might you advance, or what other sort of things should we be considering in adopting these layers into our research? So first is this concept of FAIR, and by now probably nearly everyone has heard about it. It's been 2016, been around for quite a few years, and many disciplines are starting to get quite serious about it, especially in terms of journal publication. So it's about findability. That stuff is findable, I guess, is the key, is the basic stuff. The accessibility, so the DOI is kind of a sort of proxy for accessibility. In interoperability, so using open source software is kind of key indicator of interoperability. This looks like a file that maybe is a proprietary binary file generated by some software that's not very interoperable. And reusability, the thing to do around that is to attach some kind of license to your materials to clearly indicate your intentions for other people. So most of these things kind of come along for the ride when doing any of these layers of reproducibility. But perhaps this is one way that you can help to justify doing that, because there's this concept of being fair as a researcher, and adopting nearly any one of these layers sort of supports fair work. A related kind of acronym, a somewhat newer one, just 2 years ago, is CARE, and this is more in response to ethical and epistemological kind of questions or issues, especially in my field around the use of like ancient DNA and DNA of groups that maybe don't have, there are stories of researchers that sort of go into museums in like Pacific Islands or African countries and just scoop up large chunks of bones from the museum storage and take them back to their fancy labs and do paleo DNA work. And none of the people in those countries, the museums, the local community of scholars are involved in any way, and that clearly doesn't seem right. And so in thinking about how to guide researchers to not do that kind of thing, this acronym has been proposed where people can, when collecting data and analyzing data and sharing in particular, right? Sometimes it's not always right to share all the data. So where everyone, the necessary stakeholders involved, for example, indigenous communities or vulnerable communities, maybe not be indigenous, they should have some role in saying what gets shared and what doesn't. They may have things in that data that are sensitive or private or could cause harm if they're widely known according to their risk assessment, and we need to be mindful of that. And it means that sharing is not always the right thing, especially of data sets. And so this is a convenient way of approaching some of these challenging issues that are becoming increasingly important about being sensitive with data and recognizing that other people, not just the research community, have rights and interest in it. So that will guide you, I think, to know when not to share and how to communicate if you're not sharing something about the risks that are involved and the consultation that you've done. So in terms of teaching, so obviously it's all very nice for you and I to talk to each other. I'm assuming I'm not speaking to any undergraduates, but it's undergraduates that are going to be the people that are going to do these kind of things. And we do need to, if we are to make this somewhat more mainstream and normalize it, then the undergraduates need to be getting a solid dose of it before they graduate, so that it becomes a thing that they expect to be doing later on in their career for those that choose to go on to research careers. So some research communities do have this concept of a replication assignment. In economics, as I mentioned, that's been a fairly standard part of graduate education in many institutions. And in my field of archaeology, we sort of tried to transport this over and provide some guidance in this journal article about, for archaeologists, like how can we have replication assignments where students can find data and code that has already been shared and then tweak it in some small way to add some value and answer new questions about that study. And I think these kind of things can be done productively in pretty much any discipline. And so the thing that we should all be doing is practice a pedagogy in our teaching or supervision that values transparency and reproducibility, as a thing that's worth spending time on, and that can support like career development and progression as well. So even if you're not using R and Python in the classroom, and because it's not in many social sciences, not every single class will do that, of course, I understand. But you can have students become aware of data from repositories just by having them look at data sets and look at metadata in particular to see what the data are about. Have students submit data files as part of the assignment if they're working in Excel, for example. Just the idea of creating some kind of basic compendium, I think, is useful pedagogy. And have them submit this sort of supplementary information, as we do for our journal articles. Students can submit them for their sort of empirical quantitative assignments, and then maybe even add a kind of step to the assignment where another student or another group of students has to reproduce their analysis based on that supplementary thing. So there are some ways of supporting transparency and reproducibility, even if you're not using a programming language in your undergraduate teaching. Peer review can be a part of that as well. I think these are all very practical and doable, and just kind of take a bit of courage to kind of do something a little different from what's customary, or have a conversation with instructors, because often our teaching is quite constrained because it has to be a prerequisite for another class, but to sort of push the needle a little bit about making transparency and reproducibility part of the values that are taught to students. I think now, finally, I think this is close to my last slide. In terms of preparing students, I'm thinking now especially graduate students, to do research that has transparency and reproducibility at its core, and they're working with integrity and impact. I think these are quite fine keywords to use in the same context. We usually use these keywords in terms of like fraud and cheating and so on, but I think they work well for thinking about reproducibility as well. We can think, and you may have seen this kind of visualization of research types. So the traditional researcher, T-shaped, having some breadth of knowledge across a wide variety of their discipline, but really having done their PhD on, maybe in my case, it would be like buttons of a certain Viking at a certain time, like very specialized depth of knowledge over something very particular in their field. And so this is very typical for our typical graduate training, for example, something like this, where you do a dissertation, something very narrow and specialized, maybe not many people care, and then you have this kind of somewhat understanding of some things. And if we accept that some layer of reproducibility is urgent and necessary, and that it's important to sort of practice pedagogy that supports a future generation of researchers using at least one of these layers of reproducibility, we need to then imagine a student coming out of their graduate training, perhaps shaped in this gamma character, where they still have, of course, that domain specificity in their dissertation work, but then they have this extra little bit of specialization it's really just a serif of this gamma character. In previous discussions of this T model, people have said, okay, there should be the pie-shaped researcher, and there should be two legs. This is the traditional one, And then the other leg of the pie character is like the reproducibility and computing skills. And then in the literature, there's been some pushback. Like, that's too much. People can't do like 2 PhDs. It's already too short for, a normal PhD is very difficult to do anyway. We can't just double the expectations of our students. So that's why I've suggested this gamma character here, where we say, okay, don't become as specialized in reproducibility and computing as your domain itself, but do expect that you will need to learn some new things that maybe you didn't know as an undergraduate, that are somewhat more complicated than what you would have learned as an undergraduate, to succeed as a modern researcher, to present your work reproducibly, and to be able to be open and transparent in a way that people are increasingly expected. So I think the burden on those of us that teach in graduate programs is to find ways to deliver this to students and ensure that they have it and encourage them to do so. And I generally, so for example, in my case, I'm happy to teach R to undergraduate students, but I will not teach Git and GitHub, because I feel that's another level of complication that most undergraduates are not likely to ever have much value for in my field. But for graduate students, I will say, okay, we're going to use Git and GitHub to work together on this project, so let's work it out, and they're going to have to know that. And for many of them, that's kind of a surprise. They're like, oh, well, this is a weird sort of computer science thing. Why are you forcing me to do that? And that I feel I'm kind of practicing my fulfilling my obligation to prepare my graduate students with this small amount of reproducible and computing skills. Okay, and that is the end. So thanks so much. So there's my 5 layers, and for some projects I will just get to layer 1, and other projects will get to layer 5. I can sleep at night with that, and I feel it's useful to have them organized in that way, so I don't feel there's like a bright line cutoff where I'm like, oh, I have failed as a person who cares about reproducibility. I think it's pragmatic to imagine it as different layers with different levels of pain and commitment, and choosing the layer that's appropriate to the particular project in its community. So thanks so much.
Hope it's okay. Ben, can you hear me okay from this computer?
I can hear you. Yep. Yeah.
Great. I was jumping over here as Tweevy's computer is more functional than the one I was on before. So thank you so much for that. The first thing I want to quickly do is check in on time for you. Are you okay to stick around for a few minutes for questions from the audience?
Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
So yeah, I don't mind moderating those, and questions might just sort of be appearing in the Q&A, so I can try to so that you don't have to be toggling back and forth. I can relay them to you.
All right.
Now I'll start with one, I guess, might be a bit of a soft serve, but I was curious, in psychology, obviously there's this very intense interest in reproducibility in open science. How far has that percolated into other fields like archaeology, or do you see it as not being that percolating? It's like you had this independent push in archaeology towards open science, I guess.
No, I mean, I think like I know me and several other people in my field, archaeology, and probably look to psychology as a source of inspiration. Like, man, how do they do it? Like, how do they get so many people and such a commitment to this from a wide range of like the demography of the discipline? Like, there are some very senior researchers who are very invested in this, and lots of early career researchers who seem to bring a lot of energy to it. Like, how do they do it? Like, what's the magic that they're tapping into to make this topic so visible? And I think so in archaeology, we're very much derivative of those kind of things, like take inspiration from disciplines that seem to have it more advanced in this kind of in the technology, in the disciplinary kind of structures, like what do you have to do to submitting a journal, what's part of the checklist, like put your data here and so on. And then in the community organization elements, like Riot, for example, and other sort of sections of big professional organizations that are dedicated to these topics. So archaeology is a pretty small discipline, I think, compared to psychology and some other social sciences, very much looking to see how the bigger disciplines are doing it, and sort of looking in 2 directions, like looking to these kind of more human sciences like psychology, because many archaeologists will identify closely with what psychology, the goal of psychology as well, and then looking also to sort of natural sciences like ecology. So that's why I'm looking to Noam Ross and Carl Budiger. They're ecologists. They're working at similar scale. I guess their data sets are similar sizes. The types of computations they do are kind of similar as well, and so their tooling is quite similar. So I feel like, I can just wholesale adopt much of what they're doing in terms of reproducibility into archaeology. And so we're sort of taking inspiration from fields that are more advanced, and that's why I'm sort of secretly, well, not secretly, but really pleased to be talking with archaeologists, because it's so inspiring. Like these are already so familiar things, and I can learn things as well. So yeah.
Okay, that's an amazing answer. Just want to take a quick look around the room. Does anyone here have a question they Yeah, would you maybe start with Twee because you're physically closest?
Yeah.
All right, I'll move over a bit then. Here.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
So I guess my question is, because so I would assume that maybe in archaeology and also anthropology or sociology, I guess, like, is there more of reliance on secondary data or like big data set that is available? And I'm trying to understand like what would be some of the barriers for psychological research to kind of to rely more on secondary data? Because I just feel like as myself, we don't usually go around and look for data set to reanalyze or also check if it's reproducible. So yeah.
Yeah, good question. I think probably the answer is no. Like there's still a premium in archaeology on collecting your own data, like going out to the field, digging something up, or going to a museum collection and studying a collection that's maybe been neglected or so on, and being like the first person to kind of announce that data set to the world. I think, you know, that's still what careers are built on, is like, I dug this site or I surveyed that area. And it's a relative minority that will be looking at existing data sets that are already published and available to kind of see what new things can be asked about that. I think it's pretty small group. And I think, you know, if I was the person who had done a lot of that work and was going up for tenure or promotion or a job or something, I would probably be feeling a bit anxious because I might feel that the selection committee or promotion committee, whatever, will see my work as kind of secondary to someone who's a primary data generator who does like field campaigns or collects original data. So I think that's still a kind of risky career strategy in archaeology. But that said, there are some kind of larger kind of consortia of researchers that either pool their own original collected data or generate archives by sort of combining historical data sets that make them sort of viable and interesting and produce high impact papers from that. But I would say it's still kind of an odd thing to do in archaeology currently. You know, compared to something like some areas of physics, you know, where where it costs billions of dollars to build some instrument and they will run it for a little bit and generate a whole lot of data, and then lots of people will come and mine that data archive. I think because archaeology doesn't have that same like technical or economic organization, where we don't need $1 billion instrument, we don't need to like pool our resources to get that giant telescope or whatever. We can sort of do our field work in a smaller scale with less funding. There's no kind of real urgent incentive to work on existing data sets. So the primary barriers, I think maybe sort of the nature of the structure of the discipline. Like there's no urgency for collecting a large data set and then mining it over several decades. And then the problem that I mentioned earlier, that even though we might be working on similar data sets, so say I work on stone tools, for example, and I will measure many stone tools. I actually work in northern Vietnam as one of my research areas, actually. And let's say I collect stone artifact data from there, and then someone else from Thailand and Cambodia and all across Southeast Asia. It would be lovely to compare, of course, but each of us will be using a slightly different approach, a slightly different instrument for measuring the stone artifacts, which may not be comparable at all. So that's a key barrier, is sort of lack of interoperability between our data collection instruments, and then the data itself are like, well, only on the coarsest level can we compare. We can just sort of say, well, there's more stone artifacts here than there are there, because the counting is a fairly robust measure. Maybe weighing them is pretty robust as well. But then beyond that, for finer grain, maybe more interesting questions, we struggle to collect data in a way that really can be easily combined. And I suspect this is a kind of generic issue to disciplines that work at similar scales, like individual researchers or small groups that will kind of generate their own research instruments. There's no real need to standardize across different groups that maybe are not too involved. So that's a challenge that I think is best addressed at a very high institutional level, like funding agencies could compel people to use common research instruments, say, like, well, you don't get the money unless you're going to use that instrument that someone else has designed or work together with other groups. So the individual researcher, I think, it's they can do something, but the big effects around that kind of challenge, I feel, is going to happen at a sort of level of funding provision. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Yeah, I recall a case for archaeologists where someone got some funding to put a bunch of archaeologists together, and all the people who work on pots went into that room, and all the people that work on the stone tools in this room. And the task was like, okay, come up with like a common framework for measuring these artifacts across the different periods and places. And the ceramic people, with the pottery people, apparently they were basically fine and came up with something in common. But the stone artifact group ended up in like a fist fight, a shouting match. It wasn't a pleasant procedure for them at all. I think that's kind of like, represents the difficulties for many fields that have that kind of social economic structure of working up, collecting bigger data sets, and then available for people to work on. So in archaeology, I would say that the most exciting area for this, for like archival data sets that people can sort of return to, is radiocarbon dates. So in some parts of the world, especially like Western Europe, where you guys are, I guess, there's like tens of thousands of radiocarbon ages freely available, just like a row in a data sheet. And there's so many interesting ways in which that large data set can be investigated. And it's been so productive for many researchers to use that kind of archive. So that's one exception, I think. But then radiocarbon dating is already a highly standardized, it's a bit like DNA, like the sort of DNA can be measured in a small number of ways, and then the output is very standardized. And people often archive their DNA results onto gene bank and very distinct special purpose repositories. And so there's a high degree of standardization around that data set. And radiocarbon ages are kind of like our DNA, like highly standardized analytical procedure, highly standardized data structure. The methods are quite standardized. So that's the sort of our current kind of gold mine, if you like, of big data that I feel many people are benefiting from. Yeah.
Sam, I think you might have had a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, just stretching the camera around for the room. Here, we can turn it a bit.
Oh, great. Hi.
Sorry, just rearranging the furniture to get in. Thanks very much for that. I guess one question I had was, and you sort of touched on this a little bit, what do you think is reasonable to expect at different levels, right? Because, I mean, for me in psychology, I find that getting them to produce an R script or whatever is, reasonable / unreasonable for undergraduates. By the time I'm talking to master's students, maybe then I'm starting to push the, use GitHub OSF kind of side of things. But once I'm talking to PhD students, maybe it's another level again. And I have in the past sort of encouraged them to produce R packages that contain with mixed success. There's no brag with
sure.
success. And I recommend Docker to anybody who isn't me. So as long as I don't have to do it, it's fine. But I guess, my question is sort of what you see as being feasible at each kind of level. What do you think ideally we should be encouraging people to do? Because as you say, there is this trade-off as we go closer into the onion or ogre or whatever it is that has layers.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I really admire the way you're sort of sprinkling these tools throughout your teaching as well. I think it's really tough. I think partly my individual preference, if I could have my way, and take over my entire undergraduate curriculum, I probably would teach Git and GitHub to undergraduates along with R, because my students did a reading that discussed it briefly earlier this term, and they were really into it. Like, when are we going to learn this? Like, what week is this coming up? I'm like, sorry, no, you guys don't do that. So they sort of seem to appreciate the value of it, but I feel like there isn't quite enough time in one term class to do that. And then I know that I have to sort of teach some actual archaeology as well, and the sort of trade-off becomes a bit complicated. But I would say, and I probably err on the sort of softer side. Like, I want the students to have a generally satisfying experience. So that means teaching them a bit less of the reproducibility toolkit, like only getting to sort of layer one, then that's fine. I want them to generally enjoy the experience, so that they have, in the future years when they become a senior undergraduate or graduate student, they will come back to it with a sort of pleasant feeling and feel like, okay, I can manage this, is worthwhile. I'm going to tackle the next level of complexity. So I would and then working with graduate students, even then I'm kind of like up to the individual student, I suppose. And if we're working on a project together, I will say, okay, how comfortable do you, let's look at Git and GitHub. How comfortable do you feel about that? Does that look like something you will manage? And if the student looks in terror, I will say, okay, maybe we won't, we'll not use that this time, maybe next year or something like that. And so it's very, I don't know. I don't think I have really any good generic advice that I would expect to be useful for anyone else. I would say very much up to the context in which we're working. Like, none of my faculty colleagues in my department really do anything like this. I mean, some of them will teach a little bit of R, but no one, certainly, I don't believe anyone is using Git and GitHub, for example. So then it becomes, it's not so easy to tell them in a faculty meeting, for example, like, oh, in this class I'm teaching these things, and a whole bunch of names they've never heard of. And they're like, are you even an archaeologist? Like, what are you doing for our program? Like, why? And then I feel like, okay, it's a difficult, they're not seeing the value of this very well. So I guess I view it as kind of a long game. I get people talking about things gradually and trying to increase the familiarity with things. And maybe in 5 years, I might well be teaching Git to undergraduates, but I try to be very sort of sensitive to the context I'm in, my faculty colleagues, what the students seem to be able to handle, for individual graduate students, what's their kind of comfort level. So yeah, you probably sound like you have a more systematic approach to the different levels of complexity than I do. I'm very kind of up to the individual, up to the moment kind of thing. Yeah, sorry, I don't really have any firm guidance. I know some other programs are more adventurous, although I'm surprised here in my university, the political science department, they have some quite quantitative researchers. But looking at some of the syllabi, as it was mentioned earlier, I manage the minor in data science. So we see all of the syllabi that are most vaguely related to data science. And they're surprisingly kind of timid in political science. They will have a student open a spreadsheet and have a bit of a look around, but that's kind of it. And I was like, why aren't you teaching your students, like we can do it in archaeology. Your political science students are surely like, equivalently capable and excited. So I can see in departments across the campus, there's quite a bit of variation in the comfort levels of introducing these various tools, compared to like computer science, where they will have a 400 level class. It's all about Docker and that kind of infrastructure. So yeah, really tough question. And I definitely enjoy reading about how people are tackling this. I hope you will write something down about your approach so that I can read it and then show my colleagues and say, look, this is what other people are doing. Like we can also have a course in our master's program that introduces reproducibility in a technical way like that. So yeah, tough one. Yeah, thank you.
I also want to follow up on the point about funding, because I just you kind of got me check back my email, because I saw that there's a call coming out, but I don't know like who would rely on these data set, but there's the funding in the UK as ESRC, they just opened a funding for studentship, PhD studentship, to propose 4 projects to reuse secondary data analysis, and I thought that was really cool.
Yes.
I do agree that funders could actually do something to
Exactly.
kind of
Yeah. And that seems like a great example of a funder really recognizing that problem and being very strategic and intentional on sort of supporting people reusing existing data sets by just saying, we'll pay you to work on that kind of thing. And people will notice and they'll be drawn to it and likely increase the number of people doing that kind of stuff and how normal it is. And then senior faculty would say like, oh, maybe they can do their whole PhD on that, working on that archival data set or whatever. So exactly, that's a great example. And hopefully other funders will follow along.
Ben, we have one question from the audience, and maybe we could make this last one just because I have to head out and I have to take the log out when I do so. But the question is, as an undergraduate, I appreciate the answer on appropriateness to level. However, when it comes to applying to postgraduate study in psychology, it's oftentimes expected that you already have in-depth knowledge.
Yeah, that's such a paradox.
For a student in that position.
Yeah, I really empathize with that question, and yeah, thank you. That's definitely a tough one, and I sort of feel similarly because have my graduate students come from other programs which they will have never had an exposure to this kind of thing, and then I'm like, okay, let's get into it, and then I realize I need to teach them one-to-one the same class I'm teaching my undergraduates, and I think the solution or recommendations, I think. So sometimes it's possible for graduate students to audit these lower level classes in their institution, their graduate institution, where they can pick things up along the way. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm teaching like a 200 level class. That's the sort of introduction to art for archaeologists. And then I'm having my new graduate students take that class as well at a higher level course code. So that's a very convenient solution that just happens to work for me. The timing just happened to work out. But that hasn't been the case for most of my other graduate students. And I will tell them to either take software carpentry or data carpentry, you may have heard of, run another kind of community nonprofit that run these short workshops that are sort of introduction to using R for research purposes, or Python, and a couple of other things. And they also have all of their curriculum completely online. So you can sort of self-teach your way through a data carpentry workshop, or you can, maybe if there's one at your institution, attend it there. We tend to run them fairly often, a couple of times a year. So it's quite easy for me to say, like, go to the next data carpentry workshop. That'll get you started on some of the things that we need to know together. And then I will kind of deal with the rest. So something like that, data carpentry, software carpentry, these short workshops that maybe run in person nearby to you, or that have all their curriculum online, you can sort of self learn yourself through. That's my kind of typical suggestion for this kind of problem. But I mean, it's unfortunate, but also kind of amusing that we have it, and hopefully something will go away as undergraduate curricula increasingly include this material. Then there'll be fewer and fewer students that land in a graduate program or a postdoc or whatever, and with these high expectations that they have had no chance to satisfy. So hopefully this is like a time limited thing, but I definitely recognize it as like yeah, like wish students would come having done that already, just save a bit of time. But yeah, for now I just empathize and recommend software data carpentry. Yeah.
Can I just like add to that? If you are a current Durham student and you're watching this and you're thinking, yeah, that is exactly the problem I'm having and it's holding me back, can you shoot me an email, please? And maybe like between the three of us, we can put our heads together and work out if there's something that can be done at least short term. But thanks, Ben.
Yeah, good. But yeah, go ahead and do that. That sounds. I'm impressed. Instant support from your faculty there.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Ben. We really appreciate your stopping in and sharing all of these thoughts. This has been amazing. Take care. Yeah, any parting thoughts?
No, I think, yeah, thank you for your patience for all the
Yeah.
technical issues that we had to work out today.
No problem at all. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed the chat. It's always fun to discuss these things with other people. So especially people who are very serious about it, hard to find. Yeah, thanks a lot.